There is one thing that bothers me that we added in the last video, and that's this inheritance right here. If you think about it, it doesn't really make sense to use inheritance because transaction service is not an entity manager service. So doing inheritance here seems like the wrong use of inheritance. So let's do some refactoring and clean this up. There are multiple ways we could refactor this. One is that we could get rid of the inheritance and then just inject the service within the controllers. And another way is that we could rename this entity manager service to something like base service class and make it abstract. That way we can provide some useful base methods to all of our service classes that work with entities and entity manager. There is really no right or wrong answer here, and I want to avoid too much abstraction to not overcomplicate. Now we won't be injecting the entity manager directly in the constructor in controllers. Instead, what we'll do is that we'll inject some sort of entity manager service and build that entity manager service in a way that it wraps around the internal entity manager in a nice way. So let's open this entity manager service. We'll rename this flush method to something more developer friendly like sync, because essentially we're syncing with the database. So we'll name this sync. Also, we can make this a little bit more flexible and accept an optional entity as an argument. And if it's given, then we can persist it before doing the flush. So we'll do entity with default value null. If entity is given, then we'll do this entity manager persist. This way we could persist and flush at the same time for simple operations. Let's also add a delete method here, which I think makes sense to make it more flexible. So we'll do public function delete. It will accept entity as the first argument, and also an optional sync parameter, which if set to true, it will also do the flush or call the sync method behind the scenes. So let's add the implementation here. We'll do this entity manager remove, pass the entity, and then if the sync is set to true, then we'll do this sync. Alright, now to avoid building wrappers around all the other entity methods that we might need in future, what we can do is that we can proxy or defer undefined method calls back to the entity manager. We can use PHP's call magic method for that. So let's implement that. So we'll do public function call. We'll accept the name and arguments. If the method exists on the entity manager object, then we'll simply call that method. So we'll do return call user function array, and we'll pass the entity manager object, the method name, as the argument, and we'll also pass the arguments variable as another argument. Otherwise, if the method doesn't exist on the entity manager, then we'll throw an exception. So we'll do throw new bed method call exception, and we'll pass the message as call to undefined method. So we're essentially decorating the entity manager object by adding behaviors and functionality. Note that this approach has its pros and cons, and you have to weigh your options and make a decision based on your application and your preferences. Now, this is going to break the IDE auto-completion in some cases because the entity manager methods will not be available on the entity manager service object when we get the autocomplete in the IDE. To fix that, we can add a mixin duck block here and specify that it has entity manager interface as a mixin. That way the IDE autocompletion should work, and it should show the methods from the entity manager interface as well. In fact, why don't we create our own interface and add the mixin to that interface, so we can have our entity manager service implement some sort of entity manager service interface. So that way we're not working with a specific concrete implementation, but rather some implementation of this interface. So let's create this interface within the app contracts namespace. And what we'll do is that we'll copy all these methods and put it in here, but we'll remove the body of the methods because we only need the method definitions. Now, for this to work, of course, we need to add an entry to our container bindings so that it knows how to resolve entity manager service interface when we're injecting that in controllers or in other service classes. So we'll copy this, open container bindings, scroll down, and we'll add a new entry here, and this will simply return a new entity manager service object. Let's import the classes and let's format the code. Then let's do the refactoring in our service and controller classes. First, let's open category service and get rid of inheritance from here. Instead, we're going to inject the entity manager service interface as an argument in the constructor. So we'll do private read-only entity manager service interface, and we'll call this entity manager. That way, everything else should work as before. As you can see, my IDE is underlining this, stating that get repository is not found on that interface. That's because we added the mixin to the entity manager service and not to the interface. So let's take this, put it here, and now if I go back to the category service, we see that the underlining is gone and we can click into this method. Now let's scroll down, and I think we can get rid of and drop this delete method, because we should be able to refactor the controller side to not have to call this delete method on the category service. I sort of want to decouple the finding part and the deleting part from being part of the same method. So let's delete this delete method. Let's open category controller. Let's scroll up to the delete method, and what we'll do here is that instead of calling delete and flush on the category service, we'll inject the entity manager service interface as an argument here. So we'll do private read-only entity manager service interface called entity manager service. Then we'll scroll down to the delete and we'll do entity manager service delete, and instead of passing in the integer here, we'll find the entity beforehand and pass the category entity to the delete method. So we'll do category equals this category service get by ID. Then we'll pass this to the delete, and we can actually get rid of the flush method call and simply pass true as the second argument, because now we have the sync option available. All right, let's adjust other methods. So we have the store method. Instead of calling flush here, we'll simply create the category this way and assign it to a variable. And then we'll do this entity manager service sync and pass the category. Now, as you might remember, this create method calls the update method, which has this persist method call. So I'm going to actually get rid of this from here and instead have that persist be responsibility of our entity manager service, because within the category controller, when we call sync, we're passing this category entity. And this method in our entity manager service calls the persist if the entity is given and then calls the flush. And this works nicely because we don't have to call flush separately, and in case we were doing this in a loop, then we don't have to call sync this way. We can call sync only after X amount of categories have been persisted. So it works for both cases. All right, and the final thing to adjust here is the update method. So in here, instead of doing flush, we'll simply call sync on the entity manager service. So we'll do sync and pass the entity this way. All right, I think we're good with categories. Let's do the same for transaction service and the transaction controller. So let's open transaction service. We're going to drop the delete method. We're going to remove the inheritance. We're going to copy the constructor because the constructor is essentially the same. So let's copy that, put it here. And we're also going to get rid of the persist method call from the update and the persist method call from the toggle reviewed. Then let's go to the controller and we're going to get rid of this flush method call from here. We'll get rid of it from here as well. Let's scroll up. We'll get rid of it from here and we'll get rid of it from here as well. Let's inject the entity manager service as a dependency here. So we'll do private read-only entity manager service interface. Then in the store method, we'll simply create the transaction variable and we'll call the sync method on the entity manager service. Then we'll also adjust our delete method the same way we adjusted the delete in the category controller. So we'll do transaction equals this transaction service get by ID, and we'll pass the ID this way. And we'll call the delete method on the entity manager service and pass the transaction this way. Then let's scroll down to the update method and we need to adjust this as well. So we'll do this entity manager service sync. Finally, we need to adjust the toggle reviewed method. So this toggle reviewed no longer does any persist or flush. So what we need to do is that we need to call the sync method on the entity manager service. So we'll do entity manager service sync. All right, so I'm going to let you adjust the receipt service, receipt controller, and the rest of the classes on your own. I'll do it behind the scenes to not take up more time because essentially it's doing the same thing. This way you get to practice as well, and we can move on to another refactor. Alright, so I did some refactoring behind the scenes. I hope you did too. I adjusted the code for the receipt service, the receipt controller, transaction import service, register user request validator, and user provider service. I also made an adjustment to our transaction entity because it was causing an error when creating the transaction manually or even during the import, because the was reviewed status was not being set and it was throwing that error. So what I did is that within the transaction entity, I'm setting the was reviewed flag to false by default. So that way it doesn't throw any errors. You can see the full list of changes as well as the final result in the repository, for which the link is in the description. So this is it for this video. In the next one, we're going to implement something from Laravel world called route model binding so that we can get rid of some of the duplicated code. It's going to be a fun one, so make sure to subscribe and click the notification bell icon to not miss it. Thanks for watching, smash the like, and I'll see you in the next one.